Hey, this is Language Shrimp. Today we're talking about parts of speech or word class. I'm going to preface with some important information, then go through each part of speech I can find and their uses and from where and to what they derive. I mentioned in my channel intro video that you should know the basic parts of speech, but they can get a lot more complex in a lot of different and important ways. Firstly, the parts of speech aren't going to be the same in every language. Some languages have more, less, or different parts of speech. Of course, the broad types of meanings conveyed by each of the English parts of speech should theoretically be conveyable in any language, and vice versa. The main question being if that language has a separate class of words with their own syntactically and morphologically unique rules to fulfill that role or not. All natural languages contain verbs and nouns to some capacity, and most, keyword most, parts of speech can trace their way back to these two basic ones. The main way this happens is a certain word class develops or contains the ability to express meaning in at least two separate ways, with one of those ways being the role that the future word class will come to fill. Then, over time, words that are commonly or more easily used in the secondary way will stop being used in their original context, while words that are kind of weird in the secondary context become less common in that context, until it is no longer grammatically correct to use most of the words of one context in the other without some sort of additional morphology or function word added on. There will always be outliers in these situations, with words that split into two definitions depending on context they're in, but at a certain point, those will be the outliers, and it will be more convenient to call the words of the two contexts two separate word classes. Here's an example. There are some languages that don't have a separate word class for adjectives and use verbs or nouns instead. If we use the verb example, then a sentence like, "The blue dog chased the quick cat," might be expressed more like, "The blued or bluing dog chased the quickened or running cat," or something like that. Over time, the word blue might be used more and more in that descriptive context, while it becomes weirder and weirder sounding to use it as a verb, until blue is used solely as an adjective, and to express the previous sentence, "The dog blued," you might add an extra particle to convert the now adjective back into a verb, and make "the dog is blue." It is also notable that a process called derivational morphology might be used to convert words from one class to another, which I'll get into in a future video. Or one word class might have a certain grammatical form that allows it to act as another word class in certain circumstances, and I'll get into examples of that in this video. Now let's get into the specifics of parts of speech. First, there are two major categories: content or lexical words and function words or particles, which I've already mentioned. Content words are words like nouns, verbs, and adjectives, where you could theoretically have an infinite amount of them to specify different things in the universe. Meanwhile, function words tend to be a bit more limited, and specify a grammatical relation of a word or phrase they modify or reference. And you'll see a bit more of what I mean by that later in the video. But it is notable that particles will often affix to words they modify or to each other, which is the basic foundation of morphology. And thus I'll be detailing specific particles much more throughout my morphology series. Now, let's start with content words, first being nouns. You should all know what a noun is, even if you aren't a nerd. A noun is a thing. The main word class nouns tend to derive to is adjectives, and commonly not really much else, although you may occasionally see some nouns be used as verbs. However, once a noun turns into an adjective, they can go further from there. The main way this works is a noun being placed next to an adjective to indicate a shared trait. If we go back to the blue dog, you might get something like the sky dog or the sky-like dog, while something like the strong man might be the boar man or boar-like man. The word like can often be a common particle to convert a noun into an adjective. As for how new nouns might develop, many word classes have nominalized forms in certain languages, allowing them to be used as a noun. Next, you've got verbs, your action words. Verbs can be derived into the most different word classes of any, including nouns, adjectives, adverbs, auxiliaries, and adpositions. One of the main reasons for this are the different types of non-finite verbs, or verbs that do not inflect for their standard grammatical categories, aka verbs not used as verbs. These include infinitives and gerunds, which are verbs used as nouns, participles, which are verbs used as adjectives. You'll notice these were how I developed adjectives in the previous example, and converbs, which are verbs acting as adverbs. Converbs aren't really in English, but it would be kind of like saying the man runningly fell, instead of the man fell while running, or the man ran and fell. As for where verbs come from, similar to nouns, they can come from a lot of different classes. Mainly nouns through the noun being used to indicate an action similar to that the noun would perform, like saying you clothes hangered down the rope, or through adjectives being put in a form that means to be blank or to become or turn blank, like with the English suffix iffy. Now we have adjectives, which describe something about a noun they modify. I've gone over how these guys tend to develop already, and I'll go through what they develop into, but it's good to keep in mind that adjectives are a very common word class. They aren't universal like nouns and verbs, but if you don't want to derive them as a class, you can feel free to start with a full-fledged adjective class in your proto-lang. If you do want to derive them, though, note that adjectives that derive from verbs and adjectives that derive from nouns may rarely be treated as two separate classes within their own syntactic and morphological rules, which is a through line of word class in general, with there being effectively different classes filling a similar or the same role depending on their derivational source. As for what adjectives tend to develop into, I've mentioned some already with verbs, but here I want to focus on adjective nominalization, where an adjective can be used without a noun, effectively taking the place of the noun. The prototypical example of this is in Spanish, where instead of saying the red thing or la cosa roja, you can say the red or el rojo. Next we have adverbs, which in some languages are just used as a kind of catch-all for descriptors, but generally they describe something about a verb, adjective, other adverb, or phrase they modify. Some languages, like German, have different word classes for most of these, but due to the fact that once you start getting to modifying modifiers and phrases, it gets harder to justify forming a new word class, a lot of times these roles will get lumped into the adverb class. But adverbs that modify verbs are the true adverb type. Most adverbs derive either from converbs, aka verbs used as adverbs, or from adjectives, in a surprisingly similar way to that of adjectives forming from nouns, i.e. an adjective will be placed next to the verb, sometimes along with the word like. It is notable that the English adverbial affix li actually originally derives from the same word as the English like. I also want to note that there are some adverbs that denote grammatical relations like a function word, but are still considered adverbs for grammatical purposes. Some examples of this being yesterday, today, and then, which represent tense, which is usually auxiliary, or temporal relation, which is usually adpositional. And here and there represent either spatial relation, which is usually handled by adpositions, or proximity, which is usually dealt with by demonstratives. Although adverbs usually don't replace these function words in a language, you'll notice how in both these cases it's kind of unclear what the adverbs represent grammatically speaking, and that's because these words are still more like content words than function words. Next, for our last content word class, we have interjections and onomatopoeia, which are your ohs, ers, and bangs. These are in fact a whole and necessary word class to distinguish. The main difference between the two is interjections express reaction, while onomatopoeia represents imitation. It is notable that some languages like Yoruba, Japanese, and Tamil have much more extensive variety and use of interjections, to the point that they are considered a fully separate word class, ideophones. Essentially, ideophones are interjections that can be used as verbs, adverbs, or particles. As for derivation, interjections and onomatopoeia can form into many content words, as the word is used to represent literally what it represented emotionally as an interjection. And when it comes to where interjections come from, they can similarly derive from many words, and or just be made up on the spot. This leads to this word class often having weird phonological rules compared to normal rules, like how pst and don't have vowels, which is unusual for English, or how in Tamil and Japanese, most ideophones are required to be repeated, like with Japanese kira kira, which is associated with glittering, or Tamil tak tak, which is associated with quick or rapid movement. Now, let's get into our function words. First, we have auxiliaries, or auxiliary verbs, and determiners, which are essentially catch-alls for particles that modify verb phrases and noun phrases respectively. They both specify a specific grammatical category or relation of the word they modify. Auxiliaries tend to specify tense, aspect, mood, voice, or evidentiality. I plan on going through each of these in later videos, but you'll notice how many words appear twice, which is because the function words can be very messy and multifaceted, often specifying more than one thing at once, or depending on context or other nearby particles. Determiners can be similar, with some determiners representing more than one thing, but they tend to be a lot more consistent. As for what they represent, they usually signify grammatical number, proximity, or definiteness. Each of these three determiner types also have a specific name, unlike with auxiliaries, those being quantifiers, demonstratives, and articles, respectively. Quantifiers are notable for being the determiners most likely to affix themselves to or merge with nouns or other particles, leading to the singular-plural distinction being very common cross-linguistically, although there's not much beyond that, and they often can be traced back through the roots of the language, although sometimes they develop from specific numerals or adjectives as metaphors for things like more or less, shift into just literally meaning more or less. Demonstratives are unique for usually being traceable all the way back through the language, usually only evolving from other determiners or into determiners or pronouns. As for specifying of proximity, there are generally considered to be 3 categories for proximity, with 2 of them being near universal and 1 being lesser so. There's proximal, i.e. this, distal, i.e. that, and medial, which doesn't have an English counterpart, but generally means that near you. Then we have articles, which are the rarest of the determiners, with very few languages actually having them, English being the exception, not the rule. They specify definite or specific arguments, i.e. the dog, or indefinite or unspecific arguments, like a dog. It is notable that the definite article almost always comes from the distal demonstrative that, and in some languages it's in fact synonymous with it. This is mainly due to the fact that if you're specifying proximity, you are almost always already talking about one specific thing. Meanwhile, the indefinite article almost always comes from the numeral 1. It is notable that some languages may require the use of at least one determiner or auxiliary in most noun and verb phrases, with English being one of the stricter ones, with it requiring the use of an article if no other particle of a certain category is used, and requiring the copula, which I'm about to get into, in one of its most common aspects, the continuous aspect, i.e. English saying the dog is chasing the cat instead of dog chasing cat, or even just dog chase cat, like most languages would. Now, when it comes to auxiliaries, there's one special guy I want to talk about, the copula. This is your am, is, be, was, were, are, and is technically one verb meaning to be. And you may remember the beginning of the video where I used it to convert an adjective into a verb kinda, i.e. the dog is blue. The copula can be used for a lot more though, and while I can't get into all of it right now, I'm pointing it out by name because I'm going to reference it in future videos. You may also have noticed that am, is, be, was, and were don't look like inflected versions of each other. And this is because oftentimes multiple verbs and auxiliaries can shift to become the copula in certain contexts, making it so that multiple words can represent different grammatical forms of one meaning. This can happen sometimes in other common words like pronouns or like with go and went, but it happens by far the most with the copula. Next up we have cardinal numerals, or just numerals. These are your 1, 2, 3, 4, 17, 126, etc. Your first few numbers can usually be traced back to early in the language, while your bigger ones are usually named by specific people at specific times when they invent the culture's number system. It is notable that, as mentioned above, the numeral 1 might evolve into the indefinite article, and other small numbers like 2, 3, 4, or even 5 sometimes affix themselves to words like quantifiers, resulting in the dual, trial, quadral, or even quintal grammatical numbers, although the chances of that are low to begin with and drop off exponentially after the dual number, so I don't recommend adding anything higher than the dual. It is also notable that certain numbers may shift to being used more like quantifiers, as their meaning becomes more vague and metaphorical or hyperbolic, like with 12, 100, 1,000, and 1,000,000,000, being used to represent vague size ranges instead of their actual numbers. Then you have classifiers, which are kind of like determiners of noun class, but they aren't considered determiners because noun class and classifiers being defined as specifying it is hella finicky. Effectively, classifiers are a particle that specify something inherent about a noun that is integral to what it is, which is similar in concept to and often results in noun class, but can sometimes just feel like glorified adjectives. Noun class is when almost every noun with a unique definition falls into one set of defined categories within the language. Each category, in turn, has some sort of important grammatical way to show that it is in that category, whether by having a specific affix or other phonological sign, having a classifier, or affecting nearby words in certain ways, which is called agreement. I plan on getting more into everything I just said in later videos. But the core types of class and classifier you might want to know is animacy or human specifying, which shows how alive or human-like something is, and may just be limited to animate or inanimate, but in some languages like Navajo and Swahili has a ton of different categories representing tons of things. There's shape categorization, which often goes along with animacy, and is also found in Swahili and Navajo. There are gender classifiers, which specify your feminine, masculine, and neuter nouns, and may sometimes only apply to people, and can often derive from simplification of other classification systems. And there's your honorifics, which specify some sort of title or role, and are often very prevalent in some languages like Japanese. and usually only applied to humans. It is notable that some languages require a classifier and some are all contexts, usually either as a measure word after determiners or as a part of a noun class system or early stage of it, and that in some languages each noun has a specific designated classifier it uses, while other languages allow nouns to use different classifiers to change their specific meaning. Those more strict classifying languages might still have some nouns be able to use 2 or 3 different classifiers, but usually in these languages, when a noun uses a different classifier, it completely changes the meaning of the noun, to the point that it's nearly a different word. Most languages on the stricter end of a noun class system will either have around 2 to 5 categories, or around 6 to 20, depending on the nature of the system, while most flexible systems might get up to 20 or more classifiers, again making them mostly just specialized adjectives. I'd also like to note that classifiers usually derive from common adjectives or nouns being repurposed, unsurprisingly. Next up, we have conjunctions, which include your English coordinating fanboys conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, yet, or, and so, but also your subordinating conjunctions like if, while, and because. Definitionally, they join 2 things together. I'll get more into how that works in later videos. These guys can develop a ton of different weird ways, mainly from adpositions, but for a lot of them it makes more sense just to drop them in your proto-lang. It is notable that generally in almost every language, conjunctions aren't inflected. However, conjunctions can affix onto other words, mainly onto verbs to create converbs, which I've mentioned, like with the Latin suffix "que" meaning and. Beyond converbs, though, there are other ways for a clause with 2 verbs to be represented. Some languages are called verb serializing languages, such as Mandarin. These guys can just add an additional verb and it will have a conjunctive meaning, i.e. saying I ran fell instead of I ran and fell. These secondary verbs may also display adpositional meanings, in which case they are called coverbs. It is notable that verb serializing languages and languages with extensive converb systems still usually have full conjunctions to handle the joining of more complex clauses. Then we have adpositions, equivalent to English prepositions, which designate a spatial, temporal, or thematic relation of a noun phrase, with thematic relation also being called semantic role, something that will be very important in later videos. Also important for later videos is that these guys technically specify noun case, although case is generally the term used after the adposition is already affixed to the noun, with the relation being the name for when they are on their own. These are your on, at, to, by, for, etc. They almost always derive from verbs in a similar way to adjectives. The dog on the couch rolled over would be something like the dog awning or sitting the couch rolled over, with awning meaning something like to be or sit on. And a good number of languages treat adpositional and verbal meanings as the same word class, although most do make the distinction between the 2. Now we have pronouns, and there are 2 main types, personal pronouns and everything else, or the weird ones. With personal pronouns, you have 3 must-have types. First person, I, second person, you, and third person, he, she, they, it. First and second person pronouns are integral to the language as a whole, and thus usually develop immediately within the language. Sometimes these pronouns will come with built-in distinctions like grammatical number, i.e. the plural of I being we instead of I's, or case, i.e. the genitive of I being my instead of I's, and I having an accusative form, me, unlike English nouns. English you used to have similar distinctions to I, your these and thous and such, and in most languages it will have similar distinctions. But due to reasons outside the scope of this video, it lost those forms, and now only really has 2 big ones, you and your. However, it has since redeveloped a plural form in many dialects either by merging with the quantifier all, resulting in y'all, or retrofitting to the nominal plural, resulting in yous, or a few other niche means. Not only do pronouns often develop their own unique grammatical distinctions on their own, but they also often maintain grammatical distinctions that are otherwise lost in nouns, like the English gender animacy distinction of he, she, it in the third-person pronoun, and the aforementioned accusative forms of most pronouns, i.e. me, us, him, her, and them, both of which are distinctions that used to be found in all nouns, but now only remain in pronouns. Third-person pronouns act mostly the same as first- and second-person ones, except in terms of derivation. Usually, the basic fully animate pronoun will develop as quickly as the first- and second-person ones, from something like that guy. But pronouns really like developing from determiners and classifiers, mainly because if you use a determiner or classifier without a modifying noun, you can still usually assume what the noun would be, which is the basis of what pronouns are. Demonstratives are the main culprits of this kind of thing, because while look at that in English generally is interpreted as look at that thing, in many languages it's more like look at that guy, which you can easily see as evolving into look at him. However, languages will also often have some noun class or classifying-like distinctions with their pronouns, even if there's no other noun class-like elements in the language, simply because it can feel weird using the same pronoun for a human as for a rock. Let's talk about some more unusual personal pronoun distinctions, though. First off, the inclusive pronoun. Take the example, we are going to the movies. Here, the word we, the plural of I, means the speaker and at least one other person. Although in this sentence, it's unclear if the speaker means we is in the speaker and the listener, aka the first and second person, we is in the speaker and one or more other people, but not the listener, aka the first and third person, or the speaker, the listener, and one or more other people, aka the first, second, and third person. Some languages solve this by having a dedicated inclusive pronoun, which specifies the first and second, and may in turn have its own plural that details the first, second, and third person. English, as you can tell, does not have this, and you instead have to say you and I. Next, there are obviate and reflexive pronouns. Take the sentence, he picked up his bag. Here, it's unclear whether his refers to the original he, something like he picked up his own bag, or if his refers to some other person, i.e. he picked up the other guy's bag. And you can see that we can simulate a more clear sentence, but some languages have a more dedicated pronoun for it. If a language has a reflexive pronoun, then there would be a separate pronoun meaning his own. And English actually does have a reflexive pronoun, himself, as in he hit himself, as opposed to he hit him. It just doesn't have a genitive or possessive reflexive pronoun, which is why I use this example. Another strategy, though, is to instead have the default mean his own, and instead have another pronoun called the obviate pronoun for the other guy. This is called an obviate proximate system, not to be confused with demonstrative proximal medial distal system. And while you can simulate it with the other guy, this is very much not in English. So he hit him would mean he hit himself, and he hit obviate would mean default English he hit him, or he hit the other guy. We still aren't finished, though. I mentioned how demonstratives can often develop into pronouns, and that pronouns can have noun-like distinctions such as number. Well, unsurprisingly, pronouns can also have proximity distinctions like demonstratives. And pronouns may or may not, in fact, be required to choose a proximity in languages that have that distinction. This would basically be the difference between that guy for the distal, this guy for proximal, and that guy near you for medial, with that guy being the default akin to she, her, he, him. As for definiteness distinctions in pronouns, that's a bit weirder, because all personal pronouns are inherently definite, because you're referring back to a specific person or thing, and thus indefinite pronouns aren't personal pronouns. That doesn't mean they don't exist, though. Many languages, including English, use quantifiers as indefinite pronouns, such as in one might assume or some might say. Now let's talk about some other weirdos. Interrogative words and relative pronouns. Interrogative words are your who, what, when, where, why, how, whether, and which. And I don't know why whether and which are usually left off, because they definitely count. These guys each have their own sets of multiple word classes they can fall into in different contexts, to the point that they are often taped off as their own mini-word class that can fill a bunch of roles. However, these roles usually involve a question, hence the title interrogative words. A lot of the time, there is also what is called the polar question particle, or yes or no question particle, which designates whether a statement is a statement or a yes-no question, aka a polar question. English's strategy of moving the finite verb to the front of the sentence is mostly unique to the Germanic languages. Almost every other language prefers the particle method. This yes-no particle in some languages may be the same as the yes or no answer, which would kind of look like saying, you walk the dog, yes? Or you walk the dog, no? Which you may recognize as being how many people for whom English is a second language ask questions. Because, as mentioned, our question construction is very weird cross-linguistically. The yes-no particle may also be a basic interrogative word like what, akin to saying, what, you walk the dog? Or it could be its own unique word. As for your other interrogative words, the English setup isn't the only list of WH words available. Latin contains a few more, such as qualis, meaning what kind. And you can tell by the way I translated that word how interrogatives often develop. Usually there's one or two base interrogatives like what, which, or where, that then combine with other words to form new interrogatives. For example, before the word why in English shifted to its modern meaning, we used the word wherefore. Similarly, where could come from which or what place, when could come from which or what time, etc. Which is part of the reason most of the question words in English start with WH, originally coming from different forms and mergers of the Proto-Indo-European interrogative quid, meaning what. As for relative pronouns, most languages select a few interrogatives or determiners to be the relative pronouns, which are pronouns that mark off relative clauses. The English ones are which, who, and that, as in the car, which was pink, the man who walked the dog, or the car that broke. I'm not sure which of these strategies for relative pronouns are more common cross-linguistically. Comment down below if you know, but I do know some languages have unique words that only serve as relative pronouns. Finally, there's one more weird little guy I wanted to talk about. The negative, i.e. not. Use-wise, the negative is very strongly an adverb, in that it modifies verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and other phrases. But it feels weird lumping it in with other adverbs because it so often does its own stuff syntactically and morphologically. It will often affix itself to verbs, auxiliaries, or adjectives, like English isn't or unhappy. And while English is weird for it not allowing the man not walk the dog, instead requiring the use of the auxiliary did or do along with it, most languages allow the negative to just sit right next to the verb it negates, like an adverb. It is also notable that the process of double or even triple negation is very common due to how important negation is. Although English actively disallows that officially, some languages officially support it, and many dialects of English still contain double negatives. And that should be all for this video. My original plan was to make this video on head directionality and basic word order, and to release it the 1st of September, because I was going to be busy with other stuff for the foreseeable future. But then I realized I should go over parts of speech first, so I started writing that video and thought I'd have time to summarize a bit of word order at the end. But then I kept falling down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, hence this being out whenever it ends up coming out and not September 1st. And there's still so much I didn't cover on parts of speech alone. So I eventually realized I definitely would have to make head directionality a separate video. So that's probably what will be coming next. Bye!